Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. We'll start off with council meeting follow-up. Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good evening, everybody. I'm not aware of any other follow-up that isn't already sort of broken out on the agenda. And so at this point, I don't have anything to proffer for this part of the agenda.
Okay, anybody else have anything? Okay. All right, so, no, we do have a new clock. Nice.
Is the time right? I hope the time is right.
It is.
Steve, can you see it?
Get a whole new clock?
Just making sure Steve can see it. Can you see it, Steve? Just making sure you can see the numbers and everything.
We're talking.
I love you, Steve.
Steve Cathy, for the record.
Steve Cathy, not the mayor.
It's not his sight that's the problem, it's his hearing.
All right, we'll move on to Community Promotions Funding Part 1. Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of the council. This item, along with many others that we're going to be discussing between now and through the end of April, is in some fashion dealing with budget design. And so community promotions, albeit a small piece of the general fund budget and actually the city council's budget, is aimed to do just that. A big part of what we need tonight is how you feel about a number that should be applied to this program. And just as a reminder, the program that we're talking about here tonight is the concept of investing in events and activities that would be aimed and oriented at bringing people into the community. And so if indeed there are, a modicum of tax dollars that can make an event happen that brings folks into the community who will also spend their dollars here while they're with us, then that is the aim and the goal of what community promotions is all about. Now, you'll notice in the applications that there are a couple that we would suggest do not fit because the rules are pretty clear, and statute actually would also suggest that funding for-profit ventures, even if they're aimed at bringing folks into town, is not something that is permissible for council to consider. The other side of it is that council may want to consider is with regard to agencies that either double dip or use this as an opportunity to offset operational needs versus costs that are associated with an event aimed at bringing people into the community. So in those circumstances, I would suggest that if you're already giving money to an agency through 1 cent or other operational dollars that you've made available to that agency, I would propose that the dollars available through community promotions be relegated to somebody else who doesn't have funding access to dollars with the city. And of course, council gets to decide whether or not that is appropriate. I'm simply giving you some guidelines that you may want to consider as you evaluate these requests, because as you might imagine, the amount of dollars that are being requested are more than what historically we put together for this program. Now, council may suggest that what we historically put together for this program is not adequate, and that is your decision to make, particularly since the combined value of the requests that we have in front of you do exceed the $25,000 that council has set aside in years past for programs of this nature. And so the way that works is, generally speaking, you've got a group that will ask for not only cash contributions and investments from the council, but they'll also ask for partnerships as it relates to in-kind services that we can provide with our own staff or with our own facilities, etc. What I'm telling you is, typically speaking, the council has said the total value of that investment is going to be $25,000. You all get to determine whether or not that's appropriate to continue for fiscal year 22. So with that, setting of the table, if you will, for this discussion, if I could ask the city clerk to come up and walk us through some of the finer details of what is in front of you tonight, which, by the way, is just the first part of this discussion, I'd sure appreciate it, Mr. Mayor.
Your Honor, members of council. So I sent out in your packet, you have a voting sheet, you also have some other materials. And some of that explains what our process, the process of community promotions is. This process was developed years ago to help council, to provide them with a process that's more organized and fair and a more efficient way to fund events within our community. Previously, the request would just come in year-round, and it became cumbersome for council to deal with them each time. So every few weeks, we'd get one in, council would evaluate it, and then you also stand the risk of running out of funds by the end of the year. So council developed this process, and also guidelines were developed to help council figure out what should be funded and was eligible to fund. Those guidelines I did send to you. They were in the application. And it looks like this. But a really quick way to go over them. Basically, for cash funding, the event should bring people into the community and improve the quality of life for residents. For in-kind or facility, it can do either or, bring people into the community or improve the life of Casper residents. With that, this year we received 19 applications. As the city manager mentioned, that was a total of $95,000 worth of requests. And as I went through them, there were two that did not seem eligible for funding. The first one was the Theater for the Poor. That is not a nonprofit, and so legally we just can't fund them. And the other was Science Zone, and that one legally could be funded. We do fund them with 1 cent funding. However, their specific item that they would like funded isn't an event. They call it the Outreach and Program Support. They essentially have a few programs, and they would just like funding to help with those few programs. And then also they're calling it enhancements, where they take kids to certain events or passes to go to certain facilities within the city. So the rec center, aquatic center, and those don't really fit as far as the event portion of the community promotions. They're not doing a one-set event. They're not bringing people in. And so for that reason, I marked it as it does not meet the community promotions guidelines, but obviously it's a policy call for council, so as you go through, you can read their application and look at that one. Last year, council decided not to do the 50% for in-kind and facilities, just because some of them are pretty high if you want to fund all of them, and it would have taken half of the funding for council to fund some of them if it was just yes or no. So council decided to just fund up to the 50%. So on your voting sheets this time, I've left it at that. So what we ask council to do is just fill in a number that's up to this amount that's listed. As city manager mentioned, the previous year's cap was $25,000, and he did ask for direction as far as what you all would like to set that cap. So if you could do that tonight, that would be helpful. And then what I do is I fill it in so that on your voting sheet, it will total for you. And if you go over, so right now it's set at 25,000. So if you go over, it will indicate that in the sheet. It will change it, and you'll see that you've gone over. And if you stay underneath that cap, your number will stay green. So any number you want, I can fill that in and send it to you, so that just helps as you're totaling them up. So the sheet will total it all for you, so you don't have to calculate it every time. You can also just handwrite them and turn them in, and I can fill it in for you. So if you want to do this on your iPad, IT said that they can set up Excel on your iPads. So if you either leave them with me tonight or bring them in to IT, they'll get that all set up for you. Otherwise, you can use Excel on any other computer. And then another thing I would ask is that council just sets the date for them to be handed back in. Any date that's before or no later than Monday the 15th would allow me enough time to combine them and get it back to you so that you can all revisit this on the 23rd. Because on the 23rd of this month, you're going to go back over what council has decided. So that gives me enough time to draft the memo and compile the results for that Friday. And with that, if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer those now.
Councilman now.
Thank you, Mayor. So, looking at this, and we have obviously a lot of need in the community, but for me personally, before I can delve out tax dollars to anybody, I want to know what the impact is to the community, and that's the one thing that's missing on this, individually. So in other words, the state came to us, or the county did, collaboratively, and we gave $50,000 of our tax money to help facilitate state tournaments, knowing full well that it was going to return just under $14 million to the city. For me, it's a no-brainer. It was a great investment. I was glad the council did it. Here's my problem. Each one of these individually, I want to know what they're bringing to the city before I give $1,500 or $25,000 to somebody for an event that they're putting on. What is that? What value is the city getting for that? And I need to know that personally before I can put my name on a dollar. And it's the one piece that's missing in all this is, you know, we can go down the list at everything that's going on here, and not one of them tell me what value they're bringing to the city. So if we're going to use tax dollars, how do we explain to our constituents, this is why we gave them $25,000, because they're creating $1.7 million in revenue for us or whatever. That's the one thing I'm going to have personally before I can buy into any of this. I just want that to be very clear.
Your Honor, so basically, on this sheet, it doesn't have that. Some of them do address it. Most of them address it within their applications. So that was also sent. There's obviously 19 applications. And in that, we ask various questions of how does this meet the bringing people into the community? How does it meet the guideline of improving the life of Casper residents? And so some of that information that you're looking for will be in those applications. And if there's anything you're missing, I'd be happy to follow up with the organizations, or we could ask them to come in.
I did look at those, and I looked through them very thoroughly, but what I'm looking for is, and I understand that they're saying this is what we're going to do for Casper, and we're going to have, you know, we're going to put on an event that's going to cater to 1,400 people. I want to know monetarily what it's going to do for the city. I want to know for our $25,000, what type of tax revenue are we creating for the city itself? Not just, are you following what I'm saying? Because I read through these, and none of these are telling me that.
Yep. I can give you, it's kind of hard to look off of this and tell you monetarily what it's going to bring, but I can tell you, I'll give you, for instance, the Casper Amateur Hockey Club. I know that the money that they get, they use that in order to put on tournaments, and those tournaments are just like what you just said, putting $50,000 out there to do Proud to Host the Best. We're bringing all the people here to this community to spend their money, stay at hotels, and do do these tournaments. Exact same thing that they're doing. They're putting the money out to put a tournament on and bring in teams. And just 2 weekends ago, I think it was, there's like 15 teams that came in from surrounding states and our own state to come here to play hockey. So to me, I mean, it's kind of hard to tell you right today. I don't think any one of them can say, well, this is going to bring us X amount of dollars, but some of these are repeats that may be able to tell us in the past, you've invested this and this is what you've gotten in return.
And that's exactly what I'd be looking for. You obviously have insight to what the hockey's doing or whatever, or the soccer. I know soccer. I've been by those fields, and I've seen, you know, I know people come from all over the place, because when I lived in Lander, they came here to play. But that doesn't tell me how many teams they're bringing in, you know, how many, is it a weekend tournament? Is this a one-day event? Are they staying, you know, for the entire weekend? What type of money is it putting into the restaurants and the hotels? That's what I'm interested in, because when we're spending tax dollars, we've got to have, I think, there's got to be something there for us to say, yeah, this is why we did it. Not just, well, we're throwing the money because they're a nonprofit. That's.
Vice Mayor Pacheco.
Thanks. So I think, and I've done this every year that I've been on council, and I know we started many years ago. I think we were like 120,000. I think we used to do. So it was pretty significant. And then for the last several years, we've cut that way back, just to be a little bit more fiscally responsible. I think $25,000 is actually not a terrible investment when it comes to some of these organizations that bring in tournaments and help within the community to promote them. So for me, I don't need, I guess like Bruce, I don't know if I need specific exact numbers to say, well, we're going to bring in at least $1 million for this tournament or something. But I guess for me, the way I see community promotions is an opportunity for these programs and nonprofits that highlight Casper and bring them in at a fraction. It's a small investment that we used to do where it was 120, 130,000 or whatever it was, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, and we used to do that. So for me, I like this because it gives us an opportunity to bring in groups. I don't know 100% the numbers exactly. I know they say this is how they're going to be able to help out through tournaments. So for me, that's kind of how I felt the last several years of doing this. I think that's a really good way for us to connect with the community and the community to do it. And so that's where I am. I understand where Bruce is coming from, but that's kind of how I kind of paint it and see it. So thank you.
Councilwoman Lutz?
The other thing is, I think that we have to remember that when we're talking about the organization that puts on the state tournaments, there's obviously a lot other resources and involvements that allow them to calculate those numbers on like estimated basis. I would highly doubt that something like the soccer club has the ability to calculate how much lodging tax is going to come to the city after they stays. We could obviously ask for like general estimated broad numbers, like how many people do you think are going to stay overnight? That still doesn't translate into dollars because it depends on what hotel they stay at, because depending on what hotel they stay at changes the lodging rates that are going to be calculated. So I mean, it would be wildly unfair to like put this expectation on them of, well, I want to know what you're going to make the city, because they don't know, and it's not reasonable to ask them to estimate that. But I think we could, maybe ask them something very basic, very broad, and get numbers from there. But it's still not going to equate into numbers coming to the city. That's not something they can estimate for us.
Councilman Gamros?
Thank you, Mayor. I'll try not to be redundant because I am in agreement with a lot of the things most of the other council members have said. I do agree that I personally love the analytics that the tourism office provides us because it makes it a lot easier to make those sorts of informed decisions. I'll say personally, as I was looking through all these applications and kind of ranking and prioritizing them myself, I did prioritize higher the agencies that I understand they might not be able to give the financial impact of their events, but the mayor brought up the Casper Amateur Hockey Club, so I took a few notes on, 1,280 participants, 3,800 spectators. They paid $55,000 in ice fees. They gave their fundraising figures, their sponsorship. They said their tournaments bring 90 to 130 families for 2 nights each. I understand rates vary between hotels, but if you've heard Brooke from the visitor office talk, it's $80, $90, average nightly rate, so you can kind of put a ballpark figure together. So I personally prioritized people or agencies that went out of their way to give us the analytics they could so that we could make informed decisions. I understand they can't do the real end-up stuff the tourism office can do, but at least give us an idea of how many people this brings to our community, because this program, the way it's set up, Flora, as you mentioned, is, I wrote down, it has to bring people to the community so as to enhance economic development, improve the quality of life for residents of Casper. And then I guess a question for you, Flora, is it not also, it appears like it's not a requirement, but how important is providing activities that increase usage of existing city facilities? For some reason, I wrote that down as a component of this, and so I'm curious to know how important that may or may not be. But yeah, I guess just to close, I would say, at least in the future, I would love to see, and it sounds like council would like as much information as possible, because it just makes it really hard for us to, again, prioritize where we should be focusing when we have so little information to go off of. So I do appreciate the folks that went out of their way to provide us that. And then Flora, yeah, if you could speak to the usage of city facilities being a component of our determination.
Sure, Your Honor. Yes, that is a component of it, and that is why they are asked if they need in-kind or facilities, so that will help council prioritize the entities that will be using our facilities, and then they can get those at a discount. So that is a big part of it. And as to some of the other stuff, we don't have specific numbers as far as the Visitors Bureau does, but we do get final reports. And so for any of the entities that have applied before, I can send those out with this from previous years where it says how many spectators. And then as Councilman Gamroth mentioned, you can see, if there was a 2-night tournament or 3-night tournament, and then how many people they expect to bring in or how many people they brought in, and how they calculate that by looking at license plates and stuff like that. You can see some of that in their final reports, and so we can send that out. And of course, some of these are new programs that have not been funded before, so we wouldn't have that. But for Casper Amateur Hockey and the soccer clubs, those have happened before, and we can send those out.
Okay. Councilmember Pollock.
think this is maybe a question for folks who have gone through this process before, but as I'm looking at some of these budgets, it seems to me like some of these events cash flow themselves without our involvement and potentially have a revenue line at the bottom for the organization. So I'm curious about like, what has been the thought process in the past about how to deal with events like that are theoretically would happen without our involvement at all?
Vice Mayor Pacheco.
Yeah, I mean, for me, and that's a great question, by the way. I think for me, it's an opportunity for us for a way for us to support our community nonprofits and be a part of that that process. And so some of them do have that line item where they do make some return back to them. For me, I guess I see it as a bigger picture, and I know we're all kind of stuck on, well, how is this affecting Casper, and how is this bringing this and this? To me, these are nonprofits, not all of them that are, maybe should get these. But to a lot of these are youth programs that help young people, that help do these types of stuff. So I kind of see it as a bigger picture than just X's and O's and dollar signs and all that stuff. I see this as an opportunity for us to be able to partner with nonprofits that bring a really rich part of our community together and other parts of the community from around the state. So that's kind of how I see it. And working with those nonprofits is a great partnership. And I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Fleur, if this is really kind of the way it was created, to be able to have a partnership with those nonprofits and support them in their endeavors to achieve some success and to bring a little awareness to Casper. Would I be wrong in saying that?
Your Honor, no, I think that's exactly why it was created.
Thank you. I don't know if that helped them.
Councilman Cathy.
Well, since you brought up about the hockey club, I noticed that basically their tournaments, as Councilwoman Pollack mentioned, their tournaments seem to cash flow themselves, and that the bulk of their request was for their season, basically. And so I would be interested as well to know what Casper Youth Baseball, for example, is getting from us, or what they pay us for the fields. Same thing with the soccer club for what they get, because obviously we're funding the ball fields and the soccer fields out of our budget, and so how is that cash flowing in there as well? So are we actually subsidizing through other means their season without the tournaments? And so is their request here for their season ice time, is that something that is in a way not out of line with what we're actually providing to the soccer people and the baseball people? So that's a question I've got along with that, because like I said, it looked like the bulk of their request was literally for season play and nothing else. So I would be interested in how we're helping out the other two organizations through those programs.
Okay. Councilman Nell.
Thank you, Mayor. I want to be clear. I'm certainly not opposed to helping our community and helping members of our community, especially the nonprofits, and to bring in these things to town. That's not my stance. I'm more concerned about using tax dollars that we are in charge of and making sure that we're doing our due diligence and that we are spending them in a wise and fair manner. I think that's what we were all elected to do, and so that's where I'm coming from. It's not that I'm opposed to any of this. I love the things it brings to our community, but if I was armed with more information like the hockey tournament, for instance, or the soccer club, they're bringing 300 teams to town. We know, I don't need numbers. I know what they're bringing. I know they're staying the night. I know they're spending money. And a lot of these things I've never heard of. I don't know what they are. And so I was just looking for a little bit more information maybe, so I could help wrap my head around what we were doing. That's all it was. I'm certainly not opposed to any of it. I just want more information before I put my stamp on spending tax dollars. That's all it was for me.
Councilwoman Engbretson.
It's been a whole week.
Yeah, I know.
I just had a question. So it was the only thing that kind of just jumped out at me was the hockey. It's not an event. So everybody else is holding tournaments, or, you know, you have like fair and rodeo, you've got the week, you've got a craft fair. So we all have like a day or a couple days. We don't have like a whole season. So that in itself, from my understanding, is that something that would then preclude them from this? Just because they're not asking for an event, they're asking for a season.
They are asking for a season, Your Honor. It's a season of events, though, so they ask for all of it, but they have many different tournaments and things that go into it, so there's ice time built into that, but it is for several things, so they just do it as one ask, whereas like the soccer club splits it up into 3 different events. The amateur hockey, they just put it all in one so you can see how much total you're going to be giving them for all of their separate little events, rather than you having to look at, say, 15 applications for each tournament or each event. That makes sense.
And I guess I can just expound. I had 2 kids that played hockey forever, and so that's how I know all about the hockey club itself. But it is, you have obviously different divisions, just like you would in baseball, soccer, whatever it might be, and they do ask for all the money up front, but there's tournaments throughout the year that come in at different weekends. So as opposed to coming in here and saying, you know, on December 19th, that weekend, we need some money, and we need some money on this weekend to make these things happen, they just wrap it all into one, so.
It just wasn't clear on their application.
Yep. Anybody else? Okay, so I guess if I could ask that if we have summaries from years past, I just don't, I'd like, if we could, to get those to council to look at, if everybody's okay with that. I just don't want to get focused on just because there's a summary of somebody in the past. I don't want to just focus on them, because we do have maybe some new people in here, and I want it to be fair across the board to everybody. And then the other thing, I think you were asking for a date certain to have these completed by, so is this Friday enough time for everybody if we can get the information out to get these completed? Councilman Kathy.
Fleur had mentioned that she wanted them back on the 15th, which would be Monday, which would then give us the weekend as well to take a look at them and to sit down and fine-tune things. So I think if everybody can live with that, and if Fleur can live with that, that's the time she was requesting. So I would suggest Monday rather than Friday.
Okay, I thought she said before Monday, but.
I said, Your Honor, I said no later than Monday. Monday would
Okay.
be fine, especially since I'm going to send out those final reports. So council has time to get those. I'll send those out tomorrow.
Okay.
And they'll have time.
So by Monday of next week, we need to have these back in. Is that good? Okay.
And then,
Oh, go
and
ahead.
then, Your Honor, if you can decide on that number that you would like me to set.
Oh, and then we're at 25,000 is the amount. Anybody want to, Councilmember Pollock?
Is that combined cash and facilities, is that what you said? Okay.
Mm-hmm. And Councilman, no?
Currently, we have requests for about 95,000, right?
Correct.
So we need to whittle that thing down individually to 25,000. My last question is, will you be sending us through IT something that we can do on the iPad to get back to you, or do we need to hard copy this thing and have it to you on Monday?
Your Honor, you can do it either way. If you like to do it hard copy, you can. If you want to do it on your iPad, then you'll either have to leave your iPad with me today or bring it into IT and they'll get Excel set up. Otherwise, you can do it on any computer through your email, the Microsoft 365. It has an Excel portion in it, so you can do it on any browser. But if you specifically want to use your iPad, just leave it or bring it into IT. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
So, Mr. Mayor, 25,000 is where we're sticking?
25,000 where we're sticking. Monday is when we'll have them back to you, and if we can get summaries from past years.
Perfect.
Okay,
Thanks.
thank you. Okay, we'll move on to parking on parkways and parking manual follow-up. Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. This is indeed a follow-up conversation with respect to the policy discussion we had a couple weeks ago on this matter, wherein council expressed some concern as it relates to ways in which we could design a policy approach to this question. What we've done is we've tried to put together the means by which an ordinance could be crafted around those policy ideas and, you know, make sure you concur with what those approaches would be. Furthermore, we did visit with a number of other communities to see where in fact they were with respect to similar policy, and you had those responses in your packet as well. You will see exhibits tonight that will suggest 12th and 13th as kind of a model approach, if you will. We are not recommending at this time any other streets be included in this program. However, if indeed council wants to, you know, expand that area of town that should be considered for a program of this nature, that's certainly within the your ability to direct. And so, without a doubt, while we are suggesting 12th and 13th at this point, council can certainly apply this to whatever. But I want it to be clear that indeed we are suggesting that a program of this nature be applied on a pretty narrow basis, a specific basis, if you will, to streets who have certain characteristics that are problematic from a safety standpoint. And in our opinion, that does not include every street in town that has a parkway feature as a part of their roadscape. So with that in mind, and with those broad principles kind of framing how staff approached this conversation, I'd like to turn some time over to Director Becker and Chief McFeeters to walk us through some of the finer details and answer any questions you might have.
Okay, thank you.
Your Honor, members of council, hello again. Round two. I'm going to refer again quite a bit to the manual, to the memo that we put together. Again, the city staff team that had put together the first round reassembled. We also ended up adding the fire department representatives because we wanted to look at specifically hydrants as an effect with parkways. So what I wanted to do tonight is again stepping through what we covered 2 weeks ago. We had come forward with really 3 categories related to parking. One was the parking manual, and we proposed some changes. That's point number 1 on the memo, which were text additions and deletions, and we pretty much felt we had some favorable feedback, reducing snow route streets, and kind of looking at reprioritizing the downtown parking district and the downtown area. Number 2, we looked at fees. And while we were working with combining some fees as well as just getting rid of some special permit fees because we don't utilize them as staff. But what we did leave with, I have put together in this kind of highlighted, and you'll see it bolded in the text, is again having you all consider a one-time application fee of $25 for all parking permits. The ones that we did address and had some good discussion on were the combination with the handicapped parking space and temporary special needs if someone's had a temporary an accident with temporary immobility. We had recommended a reduction from the current fee of $300 to $50. And then finally, with the RV parking permits, staff had looked at the potential to increase those parking permit fees. And currently, RVs are not permitted to park on the city streets for more than 5 days per month without a permit. We look at that from a safety and aesthetic standpoint. And community service officers we had discussed would be in the future responsible for being the ones that would go to the neighbors once an application is submitted to seek their signature and not having that put on the property owner. Staff is aware of a lot of the feedback that came from social media about RV parking permits. You know, and when we stood up here last time, you know, we were talking about what the private market out there is offering, and I think there was a lot of good discussion in social media. You know, if you look at the fact that some of these private entities might charge, we'll just say $720 for a year. You break that down over the entire year and you're looking at $60 a month. What the citizens were talking about quite a bit, and I know you all saw it too, was, okay, but we don't have our RVs on the street for the full year. So the city charging huge amount of money, and then us having to then take our RVs to a private storage area for the winter months, because again, we like to get those off the street, as we had said 2 weeks ago, from October through April for sure. You know, moving them and then paying again an additional fee. There was a lot of good feedback, I felt, from our citizenry about that. Is $25 too low to charge? Again, that's going to be up to you all to look at what your citizenry is talking about. But again, our recommendation, we felt that it probably was a little low. But again, initial application, $25, and then some sort of an annual fee for those RVs on the street. So we don't have full direction on that, but we are conscious of the feedback, and I think we all appreciated that. And the citizenry did put some good consideration into what's happening private sector-wise, plus our public streets. The big ticket item from 2 weeks ago, of course, is the Parkway Parking. When we left the meeting, we knew that you had requested of us really an idea of where in the city parkways are. So we really did focus on the downtown core over the last 2 weeks. You also were asking a lot about accident data and the safety issues that are associated with Parkway Parking. You asked really for a general survey of how other municipal public safety teams handle parking on the parkways, and if they're even allowed in some other municipalities. And you also, we talked about the benefits and the importance of urban forestry, and our Parks Department did weigh in about the benefits of urban street trees. So that's what staff took away with a lot of the feedback that you shared with us. We met the very next day as an executive team and discussed the topics. Then again, we got the group together that represent all the different divisions and really sat down together and did assignments and did the research. After that, we got together, and that's what you see on page 2 of this memo. Staff is recommending conditions if in fact council should decide to allow parkway parking on certain streets in Casper. And as Mr. Napier alluded to, 12th and 13th were the ones we spent the most time on, and there's reasons for that. So our first condition is that a permit would be required, which would again be a proposed ordinance change. We discussed the fact that a window sticker would be part of that permit process, so it's really non-transferable versus a rear view mirror hanger. We discussed again the $25 initial application fee, and we really toyed around with what an annual fee would be, and we proposed $250 if someone is going to park on a parkway. We looked at parking in our parking structure in a lot of our city lots. We did a lot of comparison with what is again out there in the private sector. Point number 2, that property owners remain responsible for the utilities located in the parkway. We wanted to get that on record. Applications will require a mandatory site inspection by the City Engineering Division, and Mr. Beamer with our Public Services Department felt very strongly about that. The Police Department also, and those two teams would look to see if there were line of sight concerns. Safety emphasis, they didn't want to see blockage of the sidewalk, parking not allowed within 30 feet of the sight triangle at intersections, and that does correspond to what we have in our current ordinance. Sufficient width to park an authorized vehicle. So we went with the 10-foot parkway minimum, and that's where a lot of our city streets have much narrower parkways. And I think as all of us have probably cruised over the last couple of weeks, some of them are very ornamental out there and do not allow really for much more than an ornamental tree. So we went with the 10-foot parking minimum, and our recommendation to you, setbacks of 5 feet from the property line, 18 inches from the sidewalk. So again, a lot of engineering going into looking at the ability to still maintain safety and sight distance. The hard surface requirement that had been discussed, I know Councilman Nell had brought that up at one point. Again, whether we're looking at a gravel or in fact a pavement surfacing, that would be at the owner's expense and an inspection by the city engineering division. Because again, if there are concerns with utilities, underground, and access to that, city engineering would want to make that a condition. You all had yourselves brought up only motorized vehicles authorized, no RVs parked on parkways, boats or trailers. And they cannot be parked closer than 15 feet to a fire hydrant. I know our fire department did go out and look at particularly 12th and 13th Streets to look at whether there's fire hydrants mid-block. They're not. They're at the intersections. So not a real big issue there, but that was the two streets, or were the two streets that were looked at by our fire department. Limit to one vehicle per single family residence. No removal of the trees in the parkways unless authorized by the city arborist for disease or viability concerns. Only the adjacent property owner could park on the parkway in front of their own residence, that being and no assignment of use to others. Because again, if someone's going to pay to park in the parkway in front of their residence, we're not looking to see that assigned and passed around the neighborhood. And then no new curb cuts would be permitted. One thing we did talk about as a team, and and kind of did an illustration on, is if someone were to pay $250 to park on the parkway right in front of their home, and yet on 12th and 13th Street, there is the ability to park on the street. I mean, it's striped as such, you can park in front of homes. What would then happen if I paid to park on the parkway, and yet there was a party down the block, and somebody parked in front of my home, and I couldn't get my vehicle out in order to get to an appointment because there is a citizen who's parking correctly on the public street at a party down the road. I've paid my $250, so we talked internally. Do we then, as the city, go out and stripe the area, no parking, in front of a residence that has paid for a parkway permit so that we don't have that blockage, but then just say that that property sells, transfer of ownership, and then that person doesn't want to park on the parkway, then our city team would come back out and be trying to remove the paint. So those are considerations, and again, as I said, we've gone out, we've cruised, we've walked, we've considered all of this from a citizen standpoint because we know it does occur. And we did even look at 15th Street, but we did primarily focus on 12th and 13th, and the maps that the police department put together looked at the street accident activity from McKinley to CY. So that was truly the blockage that we looked at. We didn't go further east past McKinley. We were just kind of trying to narrow it to the obvious area. And again, the documents that were attached, I think I've already stepped through, but I know the police chief is here also to perhaps answer some questions about the safety component. I know Tim Cortez's team did put together, I thought, a phenomenal memo about the aesthetics of street trees, and I think there were some great illustrations in that attachment that we provided to you. So that's it. So we are open for questions and discussion and direction.
Councilman Nell.
Thank you, Mayor. So I just have four thoughts. First off, what a fantastic thing you guys did and put together in a very short period of time. So I think it came out exactly what we were hoping for or looking at. Just a couple thoughts. And I was part of the social media discussion when it came to the RVs. And if we're going to charge $250 for a year for cars, I think we should charge $125 a year, which is still a 125%, well, it'd be a 100% increase over what they're paying now to only be able to use it for 5 months out of the year. And everybody I talked to seemed to think that was a lot better than the $500. They're paying exactly half of what a car would pay, and they're using it less than half the time. That's just one thought. Second is, I think in order to incur or to stop the habitation of another car blocking in a car, I think they need to go half on, half off, because the idea behind this is to get the cars at least out of the lanes of traffic when vehicles are coming, so they're not getting hit. So I know on Cedar Street where I live, we all park up, we're halfway on, halfway off, but it still allows people to get through. Because if we both sit in the street, you're not getting through there, not in my pickup. So, that might, instead of paying for striping and everything else, it might, take care of that issue altogether. My next thought is, I don't think we should allow them to gravel that, because they're gonna be pulling rock and everything else right out into a very busy street. I think they either concrete it, or they pave it, or they don't do it. I loved Tim's presentation. What a lot of thought went into that. And I don't even think he's here anymore, but, oh, he's hidden. There he is. Great, I didn't see you, sorry. But great presentation, although I don't think it was necessary, because I think we've all agreed that no trees get to come out unless they are dead and inspected by the city and proven to be dead. Aesthetically, we're not gonna hurt our city by giving somebody a parking spot. So, and then the last comment I have would be on the window sticker issue. I know for me personally, you know, my wife and I have 7 or 8 vehicles, and so it just depends on which one I bring home that night. And so does that mean I have to pay $250 for every single vehicle so they all have a sticker so I can park in front of my house? You know, so I'm almost thinking that the hanging on the window might be better, so I can move it from vehicle to vehicle depending on which one I bring home or somebody else does. And 12th and 13th are our busiest streets, 8 million miles a year. It's where most of the accidents are happening, so I like that idea. There are other streets that it's necessary, like on Cedar, but most of us have already made the alterations, and we're already parking there, so it's kind of a non-issue for us. But anyway, those are my thoughts, so hopefully they'll help, especially with the RV stuff. Thanks.
Councilman Cathy.
I know that we are concerned about 12th and 13th, but I loved the accident data that the chief provided. And what it appears, if I'm reading this correctly, is that most of the reported incidents along 12th and 13th were intersection collisions as opposed to mid-block accidents. And so, you know, if you get to the 80-20 rule, are we trying to solve a problem that really doesn't exist? So that's a question I've got to ask based on the accident data that we've been provided. So,
Chief?
Mayor, thank you for the opportunity to address that, Councilman. That's a good observation, but in full disclosure, we are really struggling to pull what we believe is firm, accurate data. So we have a very specific request in with the state, but their wheels are grinding slower than ours are. And so the information that you have there is kind of a compilation, and there's a little bit of creepage in there. So you do have some of those accidents that are a parked car, but other ones in our query have kind of crept in on it. So we're trying to narrow that down a little bit for you. But we're pretty comfortable that the data that we had presented some weeks ago was going to be pretty accurate about the numbers, roughly speaking, about a little less than 1 a month on both of those roadways. But that particular map, we have struggled to give what we think is data that we're willing to stake our reputation on. The query with the state has taken far too long, but we're waiting for that. We'll provide it when it comes.
as a follow-up,
Okay.
what I was also interested in is I noticed some of them looked like they were off-street. So are those alley incidents, or what were they?
Mayor, Councilman, good observation. So the problem that I'm running into is we're not able to differentiate right now between a car was going by and took off my mirror, and a kid on a bicycle was driving down the sidewalk and took off my mirror or scratched up my car. That's what you're having reflected in this one. That's why some of them, so, you know, we have this program called Report Beam, where the state analyzes the coordinates of the actual harmful act. And that's what's being reflected on here. So we're not comfortable that what you're seeing is an accurate reflection of a car going down the roadway, is the proximate cause of damage to a parked car. I think there's room when you're looking at that report beam placement of the actual coordinates for the things that are outside of really what we're trying to accomplish today. So for example, at my house, my son's vehicle was crashed into 3 times this year by kids on bicycles. Taking off a mirror one case, scratching up the whole side in another one, and destroying the bumper entirely on the third one. And those were just bicycle ones that aren't really germane to the topic today.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Councilman Gamros.
Thank you, Mayor. I guess just the 2 comments I have. The first one as it relates to the RV parking permits. Liz, could you remind me, you said we only had like 10 to 12 permits applied for last year, right? And that was at $25. So I wonder if this conversation about permits, you know, we bump it up $500, you know, so a $475 increase, what percentage is that? 20,000%? I don't know. It's a lot. So if we only had 10 to 12 at 25, I wonder if we're going to get anyone applying for one at 500. So I wonder if this conversation about RV parking permits is a bit futile, because I'm worried about whether we'd be able to enforce that, or, you know, I know the police already talks about being stretched thin, so I wonder, adding all the community service officer and all that stuff on top of it, I just wonder, you know, how much we're actually going to produce out of that conversation. And then third, I guess on the Parkway parking, I guess I do want to note for anyone that doesn't read the work packet, the work that city staff did do. Yeah, you reached out to Rapid City, Cheyenne, Fort Collins, Billings, and Laramie. None of those guys allow Parkway parking other than Rapid City. So I think we're for the most part in agreement that if we do allow, we want to make sure we're not taking out of trees, we're not ruining line of sight, we're not too close to intersections on all that. But I guess I just wanted to note that whatever resolution we come to, if it allows Parkway parking at all, that's more than most any other community offers. So thank you.
Councilwoman Lutz.
I think Bruce brings up a good point of, I mean, even if it's just a married couple with 2 vehicles, obviously they both live there, and if they've put the money into, you know, putting the concrete down, they should be able to park on that parkway. So I know that sometimes with fees, you'll see like, you know, the first one might cost $250, but then like every additional one would maybe cost $50 or $75 or whatever. I mean, I don't know the number. We could obviously look at some comparison stuff, but maybe we could do something like that, where like if you did have, you know, 2 individuals living in a household, they could purchase additional permits for like a reduced rate since they've already paid, you know, basically for the spot, quote unquote.
Chief.
You know, I must admit, we didn't consider the fact of, you know, the home that has a bunch of cars and it may not be the one that was parking out. We were more concerned about those door hangers migrating, or the mirror hangers migrating into more than that they were supposed to. So we were looking at it. You know, if you go on vacation and you want to park on the beach, you get the sticker on there, and that allows that vehicle. And so that's how we were looking at it. We certainly accept the observations that council is making and leave this up to your discretion.
Councilwoman Ingebretson.
So I had a couple of thoughts. So our current ordinance, or actually not an ordinance, basically we're just turning a blind eye correctly. So if somebody parks on the parkway, it's fine, we're not ticketing them or anything else. So I guess part of it is that if we continue to do that, why would somebody pay? Why wouldn't they just continue to park? And then, so there's that thought. And then the second thought is that we still have curbs. And so as we're thinking about having people go onto the parkways, who's going to maintain the curbs and the gutters and things as vehicles are driving up and down that? Are we going to have the owners be responsible for repairing the curbs, or do we just let those disintegrate and then the city eventually comes in?
Mayor, Councilwoman, these are great points that we have pondered. When it comes to the curbs, you know, we would not want private citizens trying to maintain their own damages to it. And we acknowledge, or we believe, especially on some roadways where it's not the drive over curb, it's actually a 90-degree sharp curb, that it is going to pose problems. And remind me again what your first question was?
Right now, we're not ticketing anybody who's already parking on the parkway, so
So, from an enforcement perspective, right now it's prohibited to park on the parkway. As we were undertaking this discussion a few years ago, some enforcement was done. The citizens didn't respond to that in a favorable way. And it was council's direction to us, hey, let's wait while we straighten this out. It's for this purpose that we're actually bringing you the changes to the parking manual. This is one of the areas that we definitely need if we need direction from council, that would tell us, hey, do we want to allow this, to continue to allow it? Do we want to expand it? Do we want to retract it? Right now, right now, the only direction from council we have is don't enforce it for the time being while we decide what direction we want to go. When it comes to enforcement of these things, say, even though it's a small number of permits for RVs, much of this would be complaint driven through the app that we've established. Our citizens could make us aware of a concern. We would go look at it from that point of view, and that's the type of response we do all day long. And so much of this would not be necessarily driven by me allocating a full-time employee to drive every one of the streets. We would be relying upon, if we happen to see them, great. But if we're not aware of it and a citizen makes us aware of, hey, this is a safety problem, we'll go respond to that. And that is just like every other public safety service call that we take all day long. That just gets added into the queue. It's not going to be necessarily overwhelming to my staff to do the enforcement. Right now, we're just in this gray area of we've got something on the books, but we're not enforcing it, and that puts us in a difficult spot.
Good.
I think that just reasonably, especially for enforcement issues, that if we do agree to allow Parkway Parking on 12th and 13th, then the essential turning our blind eye and letting you just do your thing goes away. So they either have to have a permit or they can't park there. And then that would need to be added to your bullet point.
Mayor, Councilwoman, that is certainly our recommendation to you, is that you narrowly focus on the ones that the need exists versus the ones that want that exists. And so it is our opinion that we maintain the no parking on the parkway, except for as allowed by specific roadway under the conditions that we've asked for. So we agree that we think the areas that need it is open for the direction of the council, but the areas that don't need it and they're just habituated to, hey, the cops haven't been giving me a ticket for it, we want that to go away.
Councilman Nell.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to follow up a couple things for Mr. Cathy. There's a lot of accidents on those streets that don't get reported. Mirrors. The street I live on, we had 4 just this winter alone. 2 mirrors, 1 front bumper completely ripped off a car. They dealt with it themselves. The police weren't even called. So one neighbor wrote another neighbor a check, and they went and got their car fixed. I mean, nobody wanted their insurance rates going up. But the other thing also that we have to keep in mind, and if you've driven 12th and 13th at all, they're already parking on the parkways, and that is helping alleviate a lot of the situation with the mirrors and the cars being hit. So that's helping immensely. But with our rules and with the work you folks have done, if they have to pave that, they're not dragging dirt and they're not dragging rock and they're not dragging everything else, it's just going to be safer. And as far as the curbs go, I could tell you since 2012, I've been parking a 1-ton dually half on my sidewalk, and that curb's never lost 1 lick of anything. So it can handle the rubber from your tire, I can tell you that.
Councilman Gamros.
Thank you. I'll keep it short, just a bit of a follow-up because the chief kind of addressed it. Where I was going earlier with with so few permits being applied for, and the chief reiterated that that enforcement is mostly complaint-driven. I guess where I was going earlier was, does it make more sense to have a fee or a fine for, breaking the rules as opposed to applying for a permit for an exemption from the rules, I guess is kind of where I was coming at. Does it make more sense to go maybe the complaint-driven fee route as opposed to the permit-driven, exemption route? Thank you.
Councilmember Pollock.
The departure, not related to anything we've talked about yet, but just one thing I want to say before we end this discussion is we did last time talk about the possibility of, rather than CSOs going out, is using a postcard system. I didn't see that reflected in here, so I do think that's a good idea, and I just wondered if that was part of the discussion, if it's an omission, if it's yet to be determined.
So, Mayor, Councilwoman, absolutely, that is our discussion. We don't want to tie up personnel, and we absolutely did discuss a postcard or other types of notification systems. So we are looking at that. We believe that absolutely would be appropriate.
Okay, thank you. Mr. City Manager, then, could we just recap on what staff's recommendations are on this and what you still need direction on?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd be happy to. The recommendation is that for 12th and 13th at this point in time, we consider a program that allows for parkway access for folks who have houses adjacent to those particular spots, those respective spots. As it relates to the permitting that we would oversee pursuant to your approval of this process, the criteria that you have in your memo would be what we would be looking for in order to allow for that type of private access to a public asset, if you will, to have happen. And so if council is okay with the criteria, you're okay with the subject area, and indeed the guidelines that we've established as it relates to the ways in which the parkway must be altered in order to accommodate that parking, we'd be pleased to get at least a thumbs up, and we can prepare an ordinance in those regards for your formal consideration, which, as you know, would be a 3-reading process to make that happen. Furthermore, we need direction with respect to the other permits that we're proposing, fees be altered and amended to consider as well.
Okay. So on the first one, as far as the area of 12th and 13th Street, do we get a thumbs up on that? Okay. And then as far as the fees, Councilman Nell.
I would ask, and Councilman Gamroth brought up a good point. I don't see anybody coming to the altar to pay $500. I think it's too much money. I think it's too big of an increase. And I think we want to encourage our folks to register those so that they're abiding by the law. And with that process, all the neighbors have already been notified via mail. And so it's going to be pretty hard for them to come and complain if they didn't answer their call. So I like that idea, but I think we need to make it feasible in order to attract people to follow that rule. The other thing it does give us, and even on the Parkway, if I can go back to that just real quick, if people are in noncompliance, instead of the police having to go and write them tickets, we can literally tell them there is an avenue now for you to be able to park here, and we'll give you a week, and you know, go get your permit and get your stuff paved, and we're good to go. I like that better than just, you know, being a hard ass and writing tickets, I guess, in other words. So it gives them an out. But as far as the fees, I would really like to see that be more fair. And if we're charging $250 a year for a car, I think $125 for an RV is more than appropriate. They don't even get to park there half of that. And they never leave them sit there for all 5 months anyway, as we know they're in use. So I'd like to see that drawn back to $125. I think it's fair, and I think we'll get a lot of play at that. That's my suggestion.
Councilman Johnson.
I agree with Councilman Nell and Councilman Gamroth on the fees for the RVs. Going back to the multiple vehicles for the Parkway, though, I don't agree with charging for each subsequent vehicle. I think you should be issued stickers for however many vehicles are registered at that address.
Councilman Cathy.
It was brought up in this discussion that what do you do when the property sells and it moves on to a new owner. Basically, that is an improvement, just like if you build a second garage. So there would need to be something that would go along that becomes a part of the property, and when you purchase it, then you may not have to pay that annual fee, because basically, once it's in, it's in. And I guess I hate to see them continuing to have to pay the $250 a year to continue to park on something that they have spent quite a bit of money to put in. So maybe it's a $250 initial and some type of an annual fee then that is billed annually on their utility bill, so that then as the property transfers, it continues to be billed to that new owner, because you can't expect a new owner then to come in and take it out because it's there, just like a second garage, but some way to be able to make it continue on once it's installed, unless they come in and take it out and replant it.
Councilman Nell.
Thank you. Mr. Cathy, I understand exactly what you're saying, but I want you to think about this. That property's owned by the city. So if that house sells, that's not part of the property for the house. So, and if I choose to live there for 30 years, it's going to cost me $250 a year in order for me, if I'm correct, I'll pay $250 a year to park my car there. So whoever buys that house, if they want to park there, if they don't want to park in their front yard, which they can do, or make a driveway out back, then they're going to have to pay the $250 too. But as far as property goes, that doesn't belong to them. That's city property, and if they choose not to pay it, that's fine. They just don't get to park there.
Councilwoman Ingebretson.
Just adding on to him, so from my understanding, the $250 is literally just a permit to park a vehicle. It has nothing to do with the actual property as itself. So yes, you're right that it would be somewhat of an improvement. Someone could potentially park on it, but we're only talking about vehicles, not the property as a whole.
Councilman Cathy.
I appreciate your point there. And yes, basically what it is we are leasing them a right-of-way. And so, yeah, I understand that, as opposed to an easement. We are still maintaining our right to that property, and that if we want it at any time further. So I understand where you're coming from, and that is a very valid point. Thank you.
Councilwoman Lutz.
So yeah, I like the 125 for the RV. I think that's fair. Like we said, it's roughly half the year. That makes sense. And Sean just brought up a really good point that I actually agree with. Instead of paying for additional stickers, I also don't like the idea of the hanger in the window, but I do think if you can prove that the vehicle is registered to said address, that additional stickers could be provided.
Okay, the only thing I want to add to it is if you're leasing, if you have that $250 out front and you sell the property to somebody else, if they don't want to use it, if they want to use it, they just come get a permit. If they don't want to use it, you don't have to pay it. So simple as that. So if I'm hearing it right, 125 on the RV, and then multiple stickers. If the $250 is paid for the vehicles, it would be licensed at that address. And Councilman Johnson.
I think just the one issue that I have is, what are you going to do about people parking on a public street in front of that parkway? That's the one issue I think that I don't know how to alleviate that.
And you will have a problem if you paint it and then go back and have to unpaint it.
To me, that just seems like a waste of time and money.
Councilman Nell.
Thank you, sir. You're probably getting tired of me already. I could see it. Quit rubbing your head. You're going to be bald.
Yep.
The idea behind this, and if you look at the parkways on 12th and 13th especially, they're not really big enough to put an entire vehicle on. There are a couple houses, but with the sidewalk where it's at, they literally are going to have to park half on, half off if they don't want somebody to block them in. That's what they're going to have to do. That's what we do on Cedar Street, so that nobody can pull in and block you in. But it also gets your vehicle off just enough to allow the lane of traffic to flow without you getting hit. So I don't know if we can tell them, we're just gonna have to put in the memo, you might wanna be half on, half off, so nobody blocks your car in. Like you said, we can't pave curbs and then come back later and try to change that. So they're gonna have to use some discretion and use their brain when they're parking there, I would think. So, because we don't want them blocking the sidewalk either, so.
Chief, you got the answers?
I wish I did. Mayor, Councilman, I think you're making good suggestions, and really we just need direction from council. What I'm foreseeing is the ones that want to park on the Parkway, now they're half on, half off, but the ones in front next to them don't, so now I got a car jutting out. Just seems like a magnet for their car to get hit a bunch. So I'm trying to foresee what this looks like. That was part of the problem with reserving a spot in front of this house, but this house wants to park on the road. That's what we were trying to avoid. So I think you got some good suggestions. It's not a simple process. You know, I don't think there's a extremely efficient way to go about this.
If you want to see what it looks like, though, drive down Cedar Street, seriously, in the 1700 block. All the neighbors are half on, half, that's what it looks like. So, because there's not enough room for full cars up on the Parkway.
So the Mayor, Councilman, the things that are important to us is we want to make sure that the sidewalks have adequate clearance. We don't want, so we're asking for that small setback away from the sidewalk. So the only way that it may be possible may be this route, you know. So if we determine as a group that that's what you want, is that half on, half off for that section of the roadway, really, it's just a matter of implementing it in a way that everybody can kind of get along with. This is the way it's happening. It will absolutely pose problems if they're on the Parkway and then somebody lawfully parks blocking them in. That's a guaranteed brouhaha, maybe involving police, maybe not, you know, and I think we collectively want to avoid that.
Councilwoman Ingebretson.
So as unpopular as this is going to be, to me, it sounds like it would be better to just either all in or all out. So if we allow it, then we need to disallow all street parking. Is that kind of basically what you're saying, to kind of like help ease all of that confusion and the jutting out of cars and things of that nature? Basically, if we allow them to park on this, then we disallow the street parking.
Chief?
Mayor, Councilwoman, originally we were, you know, we're in for a penny, we're in for a pound on this, but we're trying to be reasonable, you know. So you have some patrons that, some residents that live there, their frontage, their property frontage allows for it. Others, it doesn't allow for it, and so that's the problem that we were getting into is we have these, you know, it could be 3 houses and then 2 that don't, 3 that aren't. You know, we agree that it's problematic. Some people may not want to park halfway on. You know, I just think there's no real easy answers here on this. But these are all things that we've discussed ad nauseum, and really are struggling with trying to accomplish the goal, which is let's reduce the property damage that's occurring on these 2 roads. These 2 roads are particular. They have 2 lanes of traffic, they're high volume, and the speed is such that people are very comfortable driving the full speed limit. May not be the same on Cedar. I would bet the average speed is much less there because they're no longer comfortable with that. And so, you know, time will tell whether or not changes that we make are going to help or pose more problems.
Okay, clear as mud.
Clear.
Well,
Thank you for all the hard work, though. That's a lot of work that went into this, and I for one, appreciate it very much.
so we have direction on everything except for possibility of double parking, one person on the parkway and one on the street. I think we've agreed to everything else.
Mr. Mayor, you're correct, and I think as it relates to, the parking halfway or parking full on into the parkways, it's really going to be a case-by-case situation. I know that for cars that are not SUVs or trucks or whatever, getting up on a higher curb like that is not going to be ideal, and so some of those vehicles are just not going to have that same appeal as it relates to getting on halfway and half off. I suspect that if indeed we did yellow curb the whole entire corridor, you would probably get complaints and probably suggest that we should correct it. So I'm guessing that would not be as appealing to those who live on that street, because some are still going to want to park on the street, regardless of the opportunity that they will have to park in the parkway. And so I think we're just going to have to accept the scenario that there may be times where we're going to have issues with this, because it is a rather unique application and a rather unique part of our community. And so I would probably not propose that we do yellow curb all the way up and down on both sides on 12th and 13th. I would probably also suggest that there's going to be a mixture of preference as it relates to parking halfway and half off versus parking their little Toyotas, if you will, up onto the parkway in total. So, I think that if there is an area that is more problematic than others with regard to that double parking, we may just have to yellow curb that particular house, if you will, as a means of avoiding an incessant occurrence of that issue happening over and over again. But I don't think that needs to be the rule all the way up and down the street, as a matter of a suggestion for you.
Okay.
You see how it goes. That's right. That's right.
Everybody good with that? Okay.
One more item that we probably need to clarify as well, I appreciate the reminder, Liz, is with respect to handicap parking. In our estimation, it is a request by a property owner to have a piece of the public property for private use. And so we are saying that a fee needs to be assessed. We don't think it needs to go the other way, like with RV parking, if you will. But I would also suggest that just doing it for nothing is probably not appropriate either. So I'm asking that council support the $25, is it 25 or 50? It was 50. The $50 fee be held intact, and we forward it for the ordinance and see how it goes.
Are we good with that? Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
I think that's all we have.
Thank you.
May I ask one more question?
Sure.
I'm sorry.
Councilman Nell.
So, for instance, on Cedar Street where I live, we're just doing this for 12th and 13th, but we can apply for a permit and have them come out and look at our particular area. Is that correct?
Mr. Mayor, what I would propose for some of those streets that are just naturally going to have these issues is that as a council says, hey, we need to consider adding such and such street in order to be a part of this program. Otherwise, without that council directed request, it will just end up as a if I got a parkway, I must be able to park in it scenario.
I would almost rather see it be, if somebody, even on 12th and 13th, they don't automatically get to go pave it and just start parking it with a permit. It's that somebody's got to come out, they got to look at it, it's got to be approved, and I would almost like to see it where we can't name every single skinny street in town. I mean, to drive down my street, you're going like this because you're just dodging the cars that are up on the curbs, right? So if it's going to be a case by case, why can't we allow the citizen to contact whoever it is and just say, I'd like to apply for a parking permit. It takes 2 minutes to drive down and go, yep, he definitely needs it, or whatever, and just do a case by case like we're kind of doing on 12th and 13th anyway, is what I think would be more feasible for everybody. So you don't have citizens on the other side of town that live on a skiddy street going, well, they only care about 12th and 13th. Listen, it's a case-by-case deal. You could fill out a parking permit. When they get to you, they'll come by and check it. And if you're approved for that, then you can pave it and park there. And you're gonna have a permit in your car. It seems to me that's a better way to go, to save us a whole lot of headache down the road.
Anybody else got any thoughts on that?
I'm just a little confused of what Bruce just said. So are you trying to open this all up now to the whole city? Or are we just keeping this back down to the 12th and 13th? Because I think we just need to keep it down to 12th and 13th and then continue to do what we've already been doing. But I'm not clear on what you were saying.
That's, so essentially opening it up to the city, that if somebody had an area that they felt that they needed to do this in, they could apply for a permit and have somebody go look at it and whether they approve it or not.
It'd be a case-by-case deal.
I guess maybe, Mr. City Manager, is this something that maybe we should try on 12th and 13th first and see if this program even works? And then if it does, then come back and have a discussion about opening it up?
Mr. Mayor, that is absolutely appropriate direction, and kind of view this as a pilot, if you will, of this idea is certainly something we can embrace. You bet.
Because lack of better terms, if it were to fail, not that I want it to fail, but if it were to fail, I'd rather it fail in one area than pockets all over the city, and then we got to go fix all the problems.
You bet.
So,
You bet. We can live with that, absolutely.
okay. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll move on to council review of proposed fiscal year 2020-2021 budget amendment number 4. Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. This might be the first budget amendment that we've gone through as a new council. And so this is, if it precipitates more questions than normal, that is absolutely okay. We would welcome those questions and invite the opportunity to orient you in regard to this process if needed. The basic idea with respect to any amendment that we bring forward to the council for consideration is really the opportunity that we have to adjust with respect to the realities that the budget year produces versus what we thought it would produce, in this case, almost a year prior to the budget being enacted. And so what you're seeing here is a series of changes that we'd like to make to the budget to accommodate what we are experiencing from an actual standpoint versus a projected standpoint. This is a larger than normal budget amendment. When you see a $23 million amendment, the assumption that people want to jump to automatically is, what are we spending that we didn't anticipate a year ago, in this case? And the reality is we're not asking for authority to spend $23 million more dollars than what was accommodated in the budget originally, but rather to make adjustments in order to accommodate a number of things, a portion of which, in fact, a real small portion of which, is actually new project requests, if you will. And so if I could, I'd like to go through that with you a little bit, and then I probably will need to invite Mr. Pitlick up to help me deal with some of the finer technical details that I'm not as well equipped to address. But as you can see in your memo, in the very first section, we are asking for the transfer authority, if you will, with regard to this budget document, to move $12.7 million from the general fund in random parts of the general fund into what we call and what you have authorized us to create in the form of a CARES fund. And so we basically are asking to move that group of dollars that we've been given through the state and the feds into a singular pot so that we have the accounting exercise better put together for those dollars and the unique character that those dollars have. So that if we ever do get audited with respect to the use of those dollars, that accounting mechanism is in place, and we've organized it in a way that that exercise will hopefully be infinitely easier. And so right there, right off the bat, you've got a large portion of those dollars taken care of, if you will, through an unanticipated revenue that we didn't expect back in June of last year, dealt with better. And frankly, I'm incredibly grateful that those dollars and that surprise has come through, if you will, in that we had no idea we'd be able to get these dollars from the state and the feds to help offset a lot of unanticipated expenses that we didn't know would be in our bailiwick. On the other hand, we also have a number of things that we would like to clean up with respect to projects that we believe you have given us authority to at least create the funding authority for. And again, if you look at CARES funding, those last two bullets on your second section is a follow-up, an accounting follow-up with regard to direction we think you gave us, wherein we did set aside as well as actually spend the $482,000 with regard to repaying our employees who incurred furlough time. That is the grand total of that recompense, if you will, to our employees, as well as the $171,000 that you gave us approval for as it relates to doing a similar thing for the employees of the event center, which, as you know, are not city employees, but rather employees of Spectra. One of the other items of direction that we felt like you gave us was with regard to combining the purchase of two fire trucks so that we could beat the price increase that's coming up later this spring, as well as gain the utility of bundle purchasing, if you will, for lack of a better way to describe it, for this phase of our fire truck replacement program. This is purchases. These are purchases that are anticipated in 1 cent 16. We're just pushing that purchase time frame up again so that we can gain the value of the bundling, as well as beating the price increase that the vendors have told us is coming later this spring. The City Hall project was technically approved with a previous council as it relates to the funds that we've identified both in this section and in the next section that you see here. What we are doing is similar to what we did with the CARES funds, wherein we are gathering those dollars that have been dog-eared, if you will, to fund this project into a singular project line, so that if this project is approved to move forward in the capital budget that we will be bringing forward to you at the end of this month, the capital agenda that we're bringing forward to you at the end of this month for fiscal year 22, that project line will be in place, and that project will be able to move forward. As it relates to the next section in your memo that talks about prior year approved transfers, we have a little bit of overlap in this section with respect to the previous section we just talked about, as it relates to the City Hall project in particular. But what we also have here is a completed project in the form of the ice plant replacement at the ice arena, wherein that particular transfer never did occur. And again, we need to consolidate those dollars into one project line so that the accounting is clean. And as we finish paying those bills, there really is no question as to what project line to put those expenses toward. And so again, it's more of an organizing exercise that that we're catching up with at this point in time for those two major projects. There are other smaller ones that are going through that type of exercise as well. With respect to carryover purchases, that section on your memo, page 2 of 3, there were some projects that were authorized, and in this case, they were purchases versus projects, I should say. They were authorized purchases, but for whatever reason, they did not get complete and are transcending more than one budget year. Therefore, we want to put together these particular transfers so that indeed this carryover takes place and that authority follows the transition of budget years and is not in question by either citizens or auditors as it relates to whether or not the appropriate authority was in place to account for these approved purchases. As it relates to budgetary adjustments, these are, which is the next section on page 2 of your memo, this is an accumulation of adjustments that are needed to accommodate shortfalls that we did not anticipate in our budget that we definitely need to get behind and fund. One of the biggest ones here is with regard to the catastrophic claim that took place with respect to one of our roll-off container haulers from the refuse fund, if you will. That vehicle, that piece of equipment was involved in a major accident, resulting in that piece of equipment being totaled. And with regard to funding that replacement, we needed to make some adjustments in our property and liability fund in order to cover the insurance reimbursements and deal with the replacement of that piece of equipment. Again, not something we anticipated, not a piece of equipment that we expected to have to replace, but given its involvement in an accident that we didn't obviously expect, we need to make those adjustments to provide that appropriate budgetary authority. The new projects section is something that I want to draw your attention to as well, because this would be a section of new expenses that we are asking for your approval to support and accommodate in this amendment so that in this particular budget year, these expenses can be dealt with versus waiting until July 1 of the new fiscal year to make these purchases happen. One of the more significant aspects of this request deals with replacing the air conditioning units at the senior center. For those of you who have been on the council, this is not a new discussion for you. This is a discussion that council heard more than once as it relates to those repairs and replacements at the senior center. And in part were dealt with in the previous construction season. The one thing that council did approve, but we haven't been able to complete in total before now, is the $130,000 that you see on the very bottom of page 2 in that first bullet. That includes the replacement of all the air handling units that are defective. We think that with the investment of this $130,000, the air conditioning issues at the senior center will be finally dealt with in total, and will wrap up the direction that we believe that your previous council provided to us, but again, is in between capital agendas, and unfortunately, in advance of the heat season, which will almost be done if we wait until July 1 of the new fiscal year to deal with. So we're suggesting that we be given the blessing to go ahead and complete those repairs in the amount of $130,000 so that indeed that project can be done once and for all, and our seniors won't have to have stifling temperatures in the senior center this summer. The $70,000 for roll-up garage doors at the 19th hole facility at the golf course is not a project that we've talked about before. This is an improvement that the concessioner is asking for so that they can have more all-weather use of the floor space that's associated with the deck seating on the western portion of that building, if you will, in order for more customers to be dealt with more effectively on a full season basis. As you know, that particular deck is open and doesn't have the protection, if you will, from wind and potentially cold weather that we get from time to time during the summer, particularly in the early part of the season. They're asking that this $70,000 investment be accommodated through the Gulf Fund reserves, again, in order to get more use of that facility. And now that we're open, if you will, or we will be on the 16th anyway, from a restaurant standpoint, seat more people in the restaurant area of the 19th hole. The last new project that we are looking for your support for, with an additional $70,000, that it just so happens that those two projects cost the same, is with regard to call center software that we're in need of replacing in our customer service area, where we deal with questions and calls from our citizens that pay water bills and sewer bills and so on. We have found through sad experience that our current system is woefully inadequate to deal with the volume of calls that we get. Furthermore, we don't have the support from a software standpoint to analyze the data that we gather through that call center system we currently have. And so while we view the $70,000 purchase as being critical for that, customer service center to work more effectively, I would tell you we don't really have the luxury of waiting until July 1 to make that improvement happen, in that we are frustrating customers pretty routinely right now. And we would like your blessing to use the enterprise funds to help this system get improved sooner than later, instead of putting this off to the new capital agenda coming up starting July 1. Not a purchase that we anticipated needing to have happen a year ago. And so therefore, that's why this request is new and I believe more urgent than most. The next section of the budget amendment that we need your support for is with respect to new revenue that we did not anticipate, and dealing with projects, as you can see in the list there. The biggest one, of course, is the Coates Road LAD. We are anticipating income, if you will, revenue, if you will, through the LAD process, $67,000 of which would come from Natrona County, $67,000 of which would come from adjacent property owners to the project. Not a project that we anticipated happening a year ago, but something that we have gained your support for and need the budgetary authority to receive that revenue. And of course, the rest on that list are obviously much, much smaller, but are similar in their need to have budgetary support to accommodate. And so with that, Mr. Mayor, that is a broad stroke on review on some of the more major, real significant aspects of the budget amendment that we're asking for. And we tried to categorize how that looks in terms of the unique nature that some of these projects and purchases have with respect to this large, unusually large amendment. And with that, I would like to invite Mr. Pitlick up for questions, and we'll try to help you as much as we can through this.
Mr. Pitlick?
Thank you, Mayor, Council. Not a lot to add to what the city manager has said. Just to reiterate, this is an unusually large budget amendment in terms of total dollars. Just a couple notes on it, particularly those for you new on council. Several of these entries were repeats from last year that we needed to rebudget. In the governmental accounting, if the amount is budgeted but is not spent or legally encumbered by the end of the fiscal year, the expenditure authority for that lapses. So then we have to rebudget again the next year in order to make it available for spending. So that is one aspect of this. The other aspect to keep in mind in many of these budget amendments, because of the way fund accounting works, it's not unusual for these expenses to be counted twice. Particularly when we move from one fund to another to be spent from another fund, we have to have the expenditure authority to move it from one fund, and then oftentimes it results in needing the expenditure authority to spend it again in the other fund. So some of these numbers get a little bit alarming, but in the end, the impact is certainly not as scary as what the initial number would indicate. So with that, if there are any questions that I could help with, certainly be willing to give it a try.
Councilmember Pollock.
In regards to the first transfer, $12.7 million, is that, the reason that transfer needs to happen is because we created the CARES Act fund after receiving CARES Act dollars?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
The dollars came in, and we didn't have the CARES Act fund in place, so we receipted those dollars into the general fund. But as the city manager indicated, we wanted to get them into their own category so we could account for them more clearly.
Councilman Nell.
Thank you. I have a couple questions. One is concerning that exact transfer. It looks to me like we received about $11 million in CARES Act fund, but we're transferring over $12 million. So, number one, I want to know why. And number two, is that extra $1 million+ coming out of our general fund to go into that CARES Act funding?
Thank you for the question. The reason that the total transfers in that category are higher, it kind of goes back again to the back and forth of the money. We transferred the $11 million from the general fund to the CARES Act fund. In order to make the transactions very transparent and clear, some of the money for expenditures, for COVID-related expenditures, were paid out of the general fund. So we transferred back to the general fund some of that money in order to make the general fund whole for the money it had spent. So it's kind of multifaceted, but that is why the total transfers are more than what went in there.
So you're telling me then that that extra money was already paid into the CARES Act fund and then transferred back? So it's all CARES money, right? Okay.
Yes, it is. Some of it just got transferred twice.
Thank you very much. That was question one. Number two is, and I understand it's an organizational thing. It seems more of a cleanup to me. But when you have money that's allocated in a fiscal year, why is that money not transferred at that time, and set up for use instead of being carried over and then having to be transferred around again? I guess I don't understand why we're not utilizing it at the time that it's allocated by the council.
Another good question, Councilman. In this particular case, the authorization was given to make the transfer, and the adjustment was made in the budget. The step that was missed was that we didn't actually make the transfer of the dollars themselves, and that should have been done. So that's why we have to come back again. This is something that you shouldn't see very often. In this particular case, we had to do it twice because the actual transfer never took place last year when it should have.
And that's why my question comes in. Why wasn't it? Was it just an oversight, or is this a general practice that we do within our city?
I wouldn't call it an oversight. What happened for a good part of this, some of those transfers are related to the Project Safe building, with the intent that things are going to happen. So the authorization was given to transfer some money for some funds to the capital fund to pay for that. and then the project stalled because of the economy and just the way things were. That project never progressed. So the transfer never was made into the capital fund because the project was not progressing. You know, we have discussed this internally and come up with a plan that I think will be more appropriate in that we actually make the transfer anyway. So it is there. So we don't have to come back and ask for that budget authority again because the transfer will be made.
Which I appreciate, because being a new council member, when a previous council allocates funds and then they're not dispersed, and it's put back on us and we don't even know what it is or where it came from. You understand? So I appreciate the fact that you're going a different route now, so and future councils won't have to deal with that financial burden again. So awesome, thank you.
City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The only other thing I would add on that is sometimes the actual execution of the projects don't follow as closely with respect to the flow of the cash. And so what happens is we transition into new budget years, we transition into new councils, and it looks like we are trying to create a new project and so forth, when in reality, we're just trying to catch up with the reality of the projects either not happening or the purchases not happening because of delays that we didn't anticipate. And again, kind of a cleanup effort to make sure that budget authority doesn't end with respect to the time by which the project actually takes place, which may be in a new budget year. And certainly with respect to a lot of the projects that we put on hold because of our concerns for pandemic impacts to our finances, we're seeing sort of the culmination of a lot of that taking place in this amendment.
Councilman Nell?
Based on the way you're going to do this now, though, you'll be coming to us literally, and we'll be giving appropriation to put the money back instead of the opposite way around. It sounds like you're going to get the cart ahead of the horse now, and when that money's allocated, you're going to transfer that money. It's going to be a lot easier to come to a new council and say, yes, you know, let's put the money back instead of let's pull it back out. That makes sense, and it sounds like that's what you're doing now. I just want to make sure I'm understanding, right?
Correct, for the most part. What I would say is, like in this particular case where we're transferring money, we're going to make that transfer dollars so that it's held in the proper fund. So in this case, the dollars should have gone to the capital fund. Even if the project had not started, those dollars should be there so that we don't have to make that transfer again. The project itself may be a different story in that if it was not budgeted or spent or encumbered in that fiscal year, it really had to come back through another budget process, either through an amendment or through the new budget. So the project may show up again, but these transfer of dollars should not.
Councilman Gamrot.
Thank you, Mayor. This feels like a small piece compared to, you know, there's a lot of big figures rolling around, but I just had one question, and maybe this is for Tim. Because my understanding, so the $70,000 for the roll-up garage door, Carter, you had mentioned that was at the request of the concessionaire, and so I was just curious, since those golf course reserve funds are generated by the users of the course, do we have any sort of system in place to get their input about what improvements they'd like to see to the course, since that reserve is generated by their fees? Thank you.
Can I defer that, Mr. Mayor?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, we do get input from the members, but probably not in the specific sense for like a specific project as we're addressing here tonight. It would be more in the sense of what would you like to see in general, and they could say, hey, we want a nicer restaurant, a better place to eat. You know, those are the types of comments we get and have gotten about that specific facility numerous times. And then also remember that we have the Leisure Services Advisory Board that collects comments, kind of a clearinghouse for this group to kind of, you know, try to get to the meat of what is needed at a particular facility. And in this case, the golf course, you know, has been ripe for a long time for this restaurant discussion. And I think that the concessionaire, so far that we can tell, and our clients and members can tell, has done an outstanding job in making all the right moves. And I think as long as that track record remains, we feel comfortable to staff that continue to support those recommendations. Hopefully I answered your question.
Good.
This isn't for you, Tim, sorry. This is an aside to maybe Carter. I'm personally curious. Thank you for the reminder of the Leisure Services Board. Do we have a list somewhere in a centralized place of all of those boards and what their roles and responsibilities are? I would be personally curious. I forget sometimes that we have, these entities in place to do sort of the legwork for us, and so I'd like a comprehensive view of all of those. Thank you.
I guess I'd like to follow, and Tim, you can give me a yes or no nod, but the roll-up doors, they're replacing where the old windows used to be out there, and so it'd give us an opportunity, if it's a windy day, they could shut them and we could still use that space. Okay. Did you have something? Councilmember Pollock.
Under the budgetary adjustments item, so this is basically talking about shortfalls that we've experienced. Am I understanding that correctly? Yes?
Mr. Mayor, Councilmember, that's exactly right. Sometimes things occur that we just didn't anticipate. The second bullet's a good example of that. The price of steel went really, really high, and that had a real negative impact with respect to the pricing that we've gotten on trucks in the refuse fund, for example. So we've had to accommodate that margin with those purchases and actually delay purchases as well.
In respect then to the first bullet point, for the truck that was involved in the accident, I mean, I'm seeing insurance reimbursements coming here, so is that we're making a budgetary adjustment because we had to buy that new truck out of some fund, and then the money will go back in that fund when we get reimbursed by the various liability and insurance opportunities that we have here? Is that correct?
Mr. Mayor, Councilmember, this amendment is meant to capture both of those money movements, if you will, both the reimbursement as well as the purchase.
It's not really a net loss to the fund.
Mr. Mayor, there is a difference of $33,000, but the reserves in the property and liability fund, that's exactly what they're there for, to cover those margins if there are any.
Thanks.
And if I may add to that, we do need the expenditure authority for the full amount, even though we are getting reimbursement. So we cannot, budgetarily, we cannot just budget the net difference. We have to have the full amount in there and then recognize the revenue separately from that.
Councilwoman Ingebrigtsen.
I just wanted to clarify, for the call center equipment, where exactly is that going to be at?
Mr. Mayor, Councilwoman, where's the software going to be located? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, so is this for the 911 or is this here for City Hall? I'm not clear on where exactly this equipment is going to be.
Okay, thank you for the clarification, Mr. Mayor, if I may. Councilwoman, this is over here in the customer service area where we take calls for people who want to pay their bills or have questions about their utility bills and so on. That's all that is. It is not associated with 911. Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? Councilman Nell.
Just one more. So concerning the striper truck, I noticed that money was allocated last year, and yet we're asking for a reallocation this year because we didn't facilitate getting that bought at that time. Are we paying more for that truck now because we didn't take care of it when we should have? Is it that truck costing us more now because we're a year later? And if that's the case, why wasn't it bought at the time the money was allocated, which is costing us more money, in my estimation, in my guess?
Mayor, Councilman, this one is not costing us more. With the vehicles, especially the large vehicles, this occasionally happens because of the lead time for ordering and the specifications that need to be put together. Typically what you'll find during the year, shortly after the year begins, the fiscal year begins, we try to do an amendment to catch up with these projects that we were not able to encumber or spend the dollars for. These particular ones kind of fell through the cracks on that. Again, the expenditure authority lapses as of June 30th, and this is legally encumbered. And given that, especially with large vehicles, again, with the lead time and also with a lot of construction projects, because they may not be completed or be able to be started before the fiscal year ends, that's the mechanism we need to use to get them back in the budget again.
I understand that. Are we putting a program in place now to stop these things that are falling through the cracks? Is there something we're doing to help alleviate this situation in the future?
Mr. Mayor, can I take a crack at that?
Sure.
Falling through the cracks, I couldn't help myself. Did you hear me? Well, can I take a crack at that?
Eyebrows?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, with respect to Mr. Pitlick's use of the words falling through the cracks, the reality is with highly specialized equipment like a paint striper, like a fire truck, sometimes like sanitation trucks, police vehicles even have the same issues. Street sweepers are notoriously problematic in that regard. We get told one thing about a shipping time frame and receiving that piece of equipment, and we actually experience something different. And so what happens is, unfortunately, that does transcend budget years. And when it does, we have to come back to you and say, hey, we need this money to carry forward so that when we pay the bill, the budget authority to do so is in place at the appropriate time frame. And so it can be really challenging for us to anticipate that as precisely as we need to. And I don't want to give the impression at all that it's an oversight somewhere on staff's part. It's just the challenge that we have when we're dealing with highly specialized, expensive equipment. And so, from time to time, we just need to come back to you and say, hey, we need this money to follow us over these budget years so that we don't, shortchange the budgetary authority and the statutory authority to pay the bills.
Well, if you will, I understand that. I owned a trucking company. I get it. And I was looking for an explanation for the public because we're being asked to allocate a bunch of money and they're going to say, how can you possibly spend that much money, when we're in a downturn? And so I wanted that explanation put out there for the public. Perfect. So that they understand why and what's going on. A lot of this money is actually already, we're being reimbursed for a good little bit of it, actually quite a bit of it, through the CARES funding, through the insurances and things like that. Even the golf course stuff is being paid for through the revenue that the golf course makes. It's not coming out of the general fund. So right. The question was not so much for me as it was for our public to understand where this money's coming from and why it's being spent now.
Well, and I just want to add one more thing to that. You got to keep in mind too, I don't think I've ever seen this amount of money that we've had come through at one time, but we also got to keep in mind, and the last thing I ever want to do is use COVID as an excuse, but you've got to look at the last year. And the amount of businesses that shut down for a period of time, you look at the supply chain of how far things got behind in the supply chain, you still can't even get a refrigerator for another 6 weeks. You've got businesses, and I'm going to use a real close example here, but you have businesses that literally went from making alcohol to making hand sanitizer. I mean, the world changed within a year. So I don't find any fault in anything anybody has done with any of this. It's the world from last year. And so I think those things have taken place too, that a lot of these projects didn't move forward because the world didn't move forward. So, okay, anybody else? Councilman Nell.
I just want to say, I appreciate the job that you do. It's not easy, and I know that. And then you have to have us grilling on you. I just want you to know I'm in your corner. I do appreciate what you do. I know this is tough stuff. It's stuff I've done all my life, and I know what you're going through, and I get it. And I don't want you to think I'm up here attacking you, because that's absolutely not what I'm doing. I'm looking for explanations. I'm looking for transparency. I want the public to understand why we're doing what we're doing. And so please, I hope you don't take my questions wrong. That's my hope.
Absolutely not. Thank you, Councilman. And just to reiterate, and maybe in a bad choice of words for falling through the cracks, but again, nothing in this budget amendment delayed the purchase of the trucks. It was just the timing of getting the money in the budget.
So, Mr. City Manager, you need a thumbs up on creating the CARES Fund line item, is that correct? And then the amendments, as they've been spelled out here tonight, moving forward on those?
Mr. Mayor, the council has already given us the blessing to create the CARES Fund, so that's done. As far as the amendment itself is concerned, the purpose of this discussion tonight was to give you the information, given that this is a big amendment, and given that this is the first time that many of the council have dealt with a budget amendment in this new year. So if indeed there is direction that council would like to see in terms of adjusting the amendment or whatever, we certainly would take that direction. But otherwise, this was meant to be just for information purposes.
Okay, this has moved forward for approval on there, so.
Right.
That's why I asked.
Yep,
Okay.
no problem.
All right.
No problem.
So, is there any adjustments anybody wants to make, or? Okay, we get a thumbs up then? Okay.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, we'll move on to tobacco ordinance amendment. Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This is a follow-up item as well with regard to some of the concerns that members of your esteemed body had pursuant to feedback received from the public and other stakeholders. And so some homework has been done at the committee level that we wanted to follow up on. The attorney's office has been involved in crafting an amendment for you to consider. And frankly, we just wanted to follow up, make sure everybody understood what was going on in preparation for the, I believe it's the final reading of this particular ordinance coming up here soon. And so with that, Mr. Mayor, we could turn the time over to the involved council people or the city attorney, whichever be your preference.
Mr. City Attorney.
Great, thank you, Mayor. Thank you, council members. Actually, we have two amendments that we have for your review and consideration, and I hope that you will, if you want to go down this path, utilize those at the next council meeting a week from tonight. We're looking at basically amendment number 1 that addresses the purchase or attempt to purchase, because that's the way the ordinance was set up, the way that the state statute was set up, kind of different categories. And then the second amendment is basically the same verbiage, except it addresses the possession of nicotine products or the use of nicotine products. Again, that's kind of consistent with the state statute, and so that's why we broke it down into 2 specific amendments as opposed to just 1. The amendments themselves, with respect to those who are 18 years and older, doesn't do anything. So whatever we have in the current ordinance that's before you or the proposal that's before you, that would stay the same, basically the $25 fine. What had happened at the last time we met was that we had some individuals who came and addressed council, and I think some of you had received some information and concerns as well from others who were thinking that people who were under the 17 and under should at least be given the encouragement, and in this case, as it turns out, probably the requirement they go undergo some type of nicotine education class or the like, so that their thought process might be able to be shaped a little bit more than simply writing a check or having their parents write a check for $25 for their use of a nicotine product or the sale or purchase of a nicotine product. Basically, the thought process with these amendments are, on the first time someone who's 17 and under has violated the ordinance, they will have to undergo a tobacco education class. The cost of that would be no more than $25. The second time they undergo a violation, if they do go violate the ordinance a second time, whether for purchase or for use, and then there would be another class, which would be a substance use interdiction type of class. And again, the cost for that would be no more than $25. If it were the third or more times, then basically they could visit with the judge, and the judge would have the discretion to say, you have between 10 and 20 hours of community service, and then the judge would also be authorized to assess a $10 court cost if the judge determined that that was appropriate. So it's really pretty consistent with the state statute, except there's a little bit of a variance there, and some of the information that was included in the memo was given to us by, I think it was almost exclusively by the Mercer Family Organization, and talks about really why individuals who are young probably need this more than people who are adults, because the neural activity, the neural paths are being more developed in adolescence than they would be in full-fledged adults. So they were wanting to at least see if they could slow down that process, maybe hopefully intercede totally with respect to some people before they developed an addiction, which would then deprive them of the opportunity to make a choice whether they really wanted to continue to use nicotine or not when they became a little bit older. So that was the thought process behind this. It was kind of an interesting process for us in analyzing the statute, and there's a section in the memo of that, starting at page 3, and it's basically, you know, the legislature anticipated that the local cities and would want, and municipalities would want to change this, and they actually had a broad statement there that that they anticipated that you would want to do that, and they said that would be fine. The only prohibition on that actually dealt in with one provision after that. They said that no government entity shall enact any law or ordinance which changes the standards provided within those purchase or attempt to purchase, possess, or use statutes with respect to those as we have them intended here, 17 and under. So we believe that they didn't use the word punishment. So this is a little bit of a variance of punishment, but it's not really much of a difference in the standards. The standards are exactly the same whether you're 18 or 21 for a violation. It's just the punishment, which is a little different, though the net amount, the $25 fine or the $25 to go to a class or course is the same. The one larger variance, I would say, would be the community service, which would be, 10 to 20 hours for a third or greater violation. But again, that would be kind of at the discretion of the court. So there would be that additional kind of oversight that the minors would be susceptible to.
Okay. Anything you want to add to it, Councilmember Pollock?
Thank you, Mayor. I think the kind of simplest terms that I can put this in, that I've been trying to wrap my head around, the best way to explain sort of the process that we've taken and the goal that we've been seeking is that really our process for handling this as a municipality was basically working before there was a change at the state legislature. So really this entire process has just been, how do we rectify the outcomes that we were achieving and that we were comfortable with as a municipality with the new standards that the state has imposed, and how do we now incorporate the new standards that the state has imposed so that we can basically put the way we deal with this back into back on track as to how we were dealing with it before. So really what you see here in this ordinance is not much of a departure from how we were handling this before. The biggest departure really comes from the fact that what the original intention of addressing this ordinance was to bring our ordinance in line with the state statute. And the complication came when we tried to figure out how do we bring our ordinance in line with the state statute while still achieving the goals and health outcomes and outcomes for our youth that we have here in the municipality that we were being able to address with our own local ordinance. So really, to me, I don't see this, it looks like a big change, but it actually, the change is, the age is now 21, and that was imposed on us by the state. Other than that, all this language is basically just to get us back to the way we were handling these cases before the state changed their statute.
Vice Mayor Pacheco.
Yeah, I'll double on that as well with what Amber said. The other part of it that I hope, if you haven't had a chance to read the memo, that I really appreciate John and his team putting together, really identifies the reason, I know for me, and I know probably for several people that were part of this ad hoc committee, of what it means for underage addictions and things like that happen. And so for me, a deeper hope, not only aligning it with the state, which we needed to do, but also to make a component where we can help young people and avert them from addiction, whether that's being cigarettes, vaping, or whatever that may lead to. And that's not to suggest cigarettes are a gateway type of thing, but I think this is common sense. I think this is something exactly what Amber said. We've had this on the books before, so we're not making the leap, and we're working with young people to help them just to work on some not such good behavior. So.
Okay. Councilman now.
Mr. City Attorney, I noticed in the memo that you wrote that there is a clause in there for them to take a class that will cost not more than $25. What happens if they can't we can't dictate to whoever's putting on these classes what they can charge. So what happens if it's a $50? Are we covering that, or?
Actually, no, they have to have court approval to do it, and so if they're going to apply with the court to be a potential source for this class, they have to get approval of the court. And we've already did talk, in fact, with the former provider, that they were willing to do it at this, even though it is a substantial decrease over what they would usually charge. But they get some grants, which I felt would help fund them back up to where the level they needed to be so that their organization could be sustainable. And so I think that we're good there. They were happy with this ordinance as it turned out. We made a couple of adjustments, trying to make sure that we didn't increase their budget too much, though this was, they were very generous in helping us both with information and time, as well as making some accommodations here.
Any other questions or discussion on it? Okay, are we good to move forward with this then? Final reading? Okay. All right, thank you. Move on to agenda review. Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As it relates to the agenda, or a couple of agendas that probably bring to your attention, in pre-meeting next week, we are hoping that we can review with you some recommendations from Mr. Cortez's team as it relates to fees associated with the aquatics facilities as well as the rec center. Very similar to the golf course, this would be in keeping with trying to meet the recapture goals that you have set for us in the subsidy equations that each of these sort of require. So we'll bring some ideas forward to you in the next pre-meeting in that regard. We also want to report to you with respect to our relationship with Napa as our parts purveyor, if you will, over there at the Central Services Center. Generally speaking, we like to just touch base with you every now and then to let you know how we think that relationship is working and what some of the financial impacts are with regard to that partnership. As you might imagine, those two elements are tainted with budget questions as well, and every direction you give us along these lines, as well as many others between now and the end of April, very much help us design the budget with regard to your input and your direction. if you look at the work session coming up on the 23rd, you'll see a number of those issues as well. Community promotions will be potentially concluded that evening. We're dealing with capital, which is a big discussion, and we'll have a lot of facets to it. The event center will be here to provide us their update and give us a sneak preview, if you will, with regard to what they think they're going to need in terms of subsidy support over the next fiscal year. And then, of course, as it relates to the second sheet of ice and the feasibility study that was done therein, where you might want to evaluate potential budget impacts or seek more homework on that matter. We also like to direct your attention to the back page, wherein we've got a number of items queued up. You can certainly see where some budgetary topics will be included, and topics that you all have requested as well. And so with that, Mr. Mayor, I'd be open to any questions that you might have with regard to our upcoming agendas.
Any questions? Okay.
Perfect, thank you.
Legislative review, Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm going to hand out a couple handouts if you don't mind. Thank you, John. If you all can just take one of each of the stacks that are coming around to you. You'll see a couple of documents pertaining to legislative information and reporting. As you can see, there are a number of bills that we have an interest in, and that will be captured in this report that you see here, and you are getting if you haven't gotten it already. And then we also have a summary report as it relates to topics that we've submitted as a part of your legislative agenda and what the status of each of those is. Now, I certainly recognize that this is the first time you've received this information, but I hope that you can use this as reference material now that we're kind of moving into the second half of the legislative session, which, as you know, started last week. It kind of restarted, if you will, last week. So what I hoped we could do is just kind of go over a few of these to give you a feel for what's happening. And if you have direction regarding any of these or conversation you want to have more, we can certainly do that. If we need to do some homework as well, we will do that on your behalf and bring back information for you to consider again. Some of these we're going to be more familiar with, and some of these are you know, haven't gotten a lot of oxygen, if you will, in the conversation around the state. And so forgive me if I don't capture one of the bills that you have a particular interest in. One of the bills that I'd like to draw your attention to on page 1 of your multi-page packet here, this report, is House Bill number 13. We actually submitted that idea, as you will see on your resolution summary as well, wherein we asked that some legislation be considered with regard to requiring license holders to post their own licenses instead of having our staff to have to enter into their businesses and do that for them. For communities like ours, where there may be 75 or so stops we need to make every year, it's a huge time savings for us. Some only have 2 or 3. It's probably not as big a deal, but for us, that's a great time savings and money savings, if you will. The other thing, though, that this bill accomplishes is changing the idea of a dispensing room to have a broader context in the form of a dispensing area. Should give vendors a little more flexibility in terms of those that hold those restaurant liquor licenses and the compliance issues that they may have with those rooms. House Bill 26 is not one that we have requested, not an idea we submitted, but nonetheless is one that we're keeping an eye on because indeed it does mean some additional funding for cities and towns if it should pass and this is a fuel tax increase of, I think it says 9 cents per gallon. The Transportation Committee has moved this forward into the general file, and we'll see how this goes. House Bill 50 is one that we're keeping an acute eye on as it relates to direct distribution. We've talked about this bill a number of times in this forum, and we're real concerned about it because we don't want to lose direct distribution dollars that are coming to cities and towns and the city of Casper. This does suggest that some whacks be taken at the direct distribution program, which would mean that the city of Casper would lose some dollars. This number is going to change back and forth. As you can see, it already has. So I'm not real prepared to tell you what's going to happen. The possibility exists that nothing might happen, and that would be good for us if that were the case. And the possibility exists that a bigger whack will be taken out of direct distribution, which would be detrimental for us. But nonetheless, I just wanted you to be aware of where that's at and what we're doing to keep an eye on it. House Bill 72 is kind of an interesting bill. This is what we call the Wardwell bill. This is the bill that those of you who sit on the Regional Water System Board is acutely aware of, wherein if indeed this is to happen, this would allow cities and towns all over the state to absorb, if you will, local water and sewer districts with a little more streamlined activity or requirements, if you will. This bill has been introduced and referred to corporations on the House side. We will keep an eye on it and see where it goes. As it relates to Casper's interests, if indeed this is something that is sensitive to activities that take place in our growth boundaries, then from a city perspective, that's okay. As long as we have the relevance and authority we need in terms of dealing with our growth boundaries and having the appropriate ability to move into those growth boundaries, then that's the appropriate thing. As it relates to regional water, that has different nuance that I'm not an expert on, but we have been trying to communicate with our Regional Water Board members so that as it relates to the influence that this might create for membership on the board and access to that water, wholesale ability, our respective board members are more acutely informed as it relates to how that could work, and they're working through those issues. House Bill 158 was on page 2, was one that was rather surprising to me to see come up. This is a bill that, in my opinion, is a direct affront to local authority, wherein the state is trying to say that with respect to the land use plans that a city or town or county even has created, and which, by the way, is required by the state of Wyoming, this bill suggests that that particular planning document, again, created with local input and as required by the state, no longer has jurisdiction with respect to zoning decisions that, say, a local planning commission might make, or a city council or county commission might make. And so I'm real confused as to what the intent is here, other than to diminish local deciding authority as it relates to zoning regulation and ordinance creation pertaining to zoning requirements and whatnot within your own community. So I'm not sure why the state would want to take on that retraction of local authority, but nonetheless, suffice it to say that as a entity like WHAM, or as a collective of cities and towns and planning departments around the state, this does create concern for us. House Bills 173 and 174 at the top of page 3 are bills that we're very interested in, wherein this deals with funding for school districts as well as cities and towns. The interesting thing about this companion bill approach is that one bill does not have any authority until the previous bill is approved, if approved. But in any case, if it does happen that these two bills would be approved, this would create some local authority as it relates to local government funding and the local government's ability to decide on funding, both from the standpoint of a penny that would be permanent for local government planning, as well as for pennies that would be allowed for the local government to decide upon at the local level and pursuant to voters and their ability to direct their local governments, whether that be a city, town, or county. So we're real curious about this. One thing that I would tell you I'm not as excited about, even though I recognize that something needs to be done about school funding in the eventual absence of dollars to support school districts and so on, is the fact that this would allow for school districts to have access to sales tax dollars, which is not the case right now and has historically never been the case. So it creates a bit of an interesting camel in the tent dilemma, if you will, because school districts have historically been relegated to property tax kinds of initiatives, and cities and towns and counties have been sort of the presence on the field as it relates to sales tax dollars. So I'm a little concerned about that particular nuance, but again, there's a long way to go between now and what actually comes out in legislation, the high probability of which would mean that neither of these survive, and that's quite possible, as you and I know. House Bill 179 is a municipal option nuance that allows for voter decisions to be made outside of only a general election. This expands that opportunity for voters to go to the booth in a May election, in an August election, as well as a general election, and not only being relegated to a general election time frame for those kinds of important questions. We have a joint resolution on local government investment opportunities. We are routinely looking forward toward tools that we can deploy in our toolbox that we don't currently have an option for. And this resolution, should it ever pass into a bill or appropriate legislation, would allow for local governments to have more flexibility as it relates to equity investment tools that are not currently available to cities and towns, and therefore the revenue opportunities that might come from a more varied investment portfolio that cities and towns, again, do not have access to right now. It doesn't require that, but it allows for that consideration to be made at the local level, if that interest exists. On the next page, page 4, down at the bottom, Senate File 56, there's a lot of gaming legislation that's out there. This one is unique in that it tries to remove cities and towns' share, if you will, of gaming dollars that are currently available to us. And so we're concerned about that idea, and we're keeping an eye on stuff like this so that indeed we don't lose our access to those kinds of dollars and revenues that have actually been relatively helpful to us. And it should be in that the services that those typical kinds of activities for a city and town require should have some element of recompense, in my opinion. Senate File 64 we've already talked about, in that it's a companion piece to direct distribution legislation on the House side that we've already visited about. We have another interesting property rights conversation going on in conjunction with Senate File 157, which is on page 5 toward the bottom. In this particular scenario, this is really a Teton County situation that's occurring right now that would have implications for every utility operator throughout the state, and in our case, for us as a city. This would remove our ability to decide how water plants and water utilities are tapped into if this legislation should come to pass. This would certainly curtail our decision-making ability if indeed we had users who wanted to come into the system from outside the city as well. And that has been a long-standing local authority decision ability that this legislation would attempt to remove from cities and towns and their ratepayers forevermore if it should pass. And so we're really concerned about it, and we're keeping an eye on it, and we're hopeful that it doesn't happen. So that is a broad brush overview of some of the more major pieces of legislation that you know, we're tracking very closely with WHAM. Again, if you're interested in what's happening as it relates to ideas that we've submitted, we've tried to summarize that real concisely in this particular document so that you can see what the status is of those, a lot of which either don't have any movement or haven't made it to the bill stage, or actually have made it to the bill stage and are proceeding. So I'd be open for any questions that any of you might have.
Councilman Gamros.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Carter, for the presentation and all this material. I personally was frustrated to see Senate File 17 die in its third reading this week. Could you please remind me, and that's related to governmental publications requirements, that's the state statute requiring our municipality to publish public and legal notices in the daily paper. Could you please remind me what the cost is to our municipality for those publishing requirements currently?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, I'm going to tell you that the combined value of those publication requirements are in the neighborhood of $100,000, if you will. If I could, however, get you a more scientific number with respect to what that costs our constituents, I'd be pleased to do so.
Thank you. That was just frustrating, seeing some of the rationale I saw from some of our state legislators opposing that. It's a little frustrating because I personally think there's different avenues, and we have a city website. We can publish that stuff too for free. So, you know, it's $100,000 we could use for some of this other very important things that we're considering. So thank you.
Councilmember Pollock.
Thank you. Mr. City Manager, is it typical to see this level of effort to subvert local control in one legislative session? And put another way, does WHAM have to constantly be on this level of defensive approach to the state legislature, or are we typically looking at more, you know, proactive offensive things on behalf of municipalities?
Mr. Mayor, Council Member, thank you for that question. It seems like every year there is some level of preemptive legislation that we have to confront. You know, sometimes we can do so in a manner that is in advance of a bill coming forward. And in some cases, like in this particular year, we are doing so in very much in a reactive mode because we had no idea that these kinds of ideas were gaining some traction. And so I would say that in this particular year, this is more abnormal in terms of the volume of preemptive legislation to local authority that we're dealing with and facing. And so it's disappointing to see, because I certainly believe that if the feds were trying to do that to the state, there would be, you know, incredible pushback and concern that the feds would have any interest in wanting to preempt statewide control. So I don't understand the reconciliation of that belief pattern to local government.
Anybody else? Councilman McCarthy.
The only thing I would like to say along those lines is I appreciate, as a member of the Water Board, sending that new amendment to us for our review. And I know in our conversations and conversations with one of the county representatives that there is considerable concern on that House Bill 72 and trying to solve a problem at the state level that needs to be addressed more locally. So continuing to work on that, but have not received some phone calls back.
Okay, anybody else? All right, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we'll go council around the table. Councilwoman Ingebretson.
I just had one thing particularly. I know back in 2018, we had a suicide awareness. I'm not sure exactly what all that encompassed, but I think that with COVID last year, and I do think that our suicide rates are up and stuff, is that something that we can look at kind of just bringing back and keep it going? I think that we have such a high suicide and suicides in people that you would never even expect. And so I think that we do need to continue to bring the awareness of suicide rates and kind of just keep that ball rolling. It can't be just something that happened 4 or 5 years ago and then we just bring it up every 10 years. So is that something that we can look at just kind of as a program that maybe just continuing going and stuff? I think Kyle can probably testify more to that.
Mr. Manager.
Mr. Mayor, Councilwoman, indeed, you know, unfortunately, you're correct. The support for those kinds of programs and the energy that those programs require does tend to ebb and flow, which is very unfortunate. But you know, it's like a lot of things, I guess, as it relates to community wide activism, if you will. Without a doubt, suicide awareness is something that really needs to have the gas pedal depressed on continuously. We do have partners that are in the nonprofit world that are oriented in that direction and are more expert in those areas than certainly we are. But without a doubt, continuing that relationship and promoting the energy that's needed for that discussion community-wide could always be improved. I would completely agree.
Councilman Johnson. Councilman Gamros.
Thank you. Thanks, Lisa, for the mention of it. It's a super important issue, and I'm personally passionate about it as well myself. For anyone that is interested, Mercer Family Resource Center, they have the Natrona County Suicide Prevention Task Force. Annually, they hold a Breaking the Silence walk in the fall. They offer mental health first aid and some other services like that. So for anybody passionate about the cause like we are, I would suggest they get involved in that task force and maybe donate to that agency because they're definitely the go-to, I would say, for suicide awareness in our community. The other things I wanted to thank Michelle Maines and Brooke Kaufman at the Natrona County Commissioner's Office. Casper Youth Council for their meeting on Sunday went and took a tour of the office, and Michelle is an excellent tour guide, very informative, very passionate about her work and about the facility, so that was very cool. Got to learn a lot, and it was cool to see how excited the kids were and all the questions they asked. I took a tour of the Good Food Hub this afternoon. Very exciting things going on over there. Their first winter market is this weekend. For anyone that isn't aware of the work they're doing, they have a commercial kitchen space there and a processing finishing area. So for the folks that would like to try to sell their homemade food products at restaurants or in stores, there's certain regulations and bureaucratic hurdles you have to jump through, but because of this commercial kitchen offered at the Good Food Hub, you can go down there, prepare your food there, and then, So I would just say if you're in that realm, reach out to them. It's operated by the Wyoming Food for Thought. They serve 1,000 children 6 meals every weekend, have set up 225 free community gardens and 5 greenhouses. They're also very collaborative. They grow hops for Skull Tree Brewing and gather juniper and other ingredients off the mountain for things like Casper Mountain Gin It Backwards. So very cool agency doing some very cool things over here at the Good Food Hub on First Street. In our work packet was also included the Casper Fire EMS annual report. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of the cool things in there for anyone that didn't see it. Our 5 stations responded to nearly 8,000 calls, including 61 building fires and over 5,000 EMS calls. We had 5 new recruits go through training, and the average response time, which entails a fire engine arriving on scene, is just over 5 minutes. So thank you to Casper Fire EMS for all the work you do, and thank you for their annual report. Very cool information in there. And I think that's actually all I got this evening. Thanks.
All right. Councilman Cathy.
The only thing I'd like to say is I'd like to give kudos to the people that responded to the fire there on the south side of town over on Sunday afternoon to keep that wildland fire contained, both through all of the agencies that participated and their excellent teamwork. I think kudos go out to those guys.
Okay. Councilwoman Lutz.
The only thing I'd mention is if you guys are calendar planning people like me, just remember that with the budget times, we do extra meetings. And so May 15th and 17th, it's a Monday, Wednesday. You're just going to want to mark your calendar for those days as well on top of the Tuesday meeting.
Yep, more meetings. Councilman Nell.
First thing I'd like to do is thank Governor Gordon for lifting this mask mandate. It's time. And those of you in the community that still wish to choose to wear one, by all means, please do. There are those of us that are ready to take them off and move on. I think we're getting closer to normal. You'll be able to go to restaurants and do a lot of things we've not been able to do. So hopefully with the vaccine and numbers stay down, but I like where we're going, getting maybe back a little closer to normal. And lastly, I would like to thank this council. It's been very enlightening being on here. I've been asked several times what it's like, and for me, it's been wonderful. And I know I ask a lot of questions. That poor Mayor, he's going to rub his hair out, I just know. Any questions, and he has to look over here at me. But I appreciate the patience of the folks that have been on here before me. There's a lot of catching up to do when you first jump into something like this. It requires a lot of questions if you really want to know, and as well as the new folks. I know it's hard sometimes going, oh geez, not him again. But I'm one of those guys. I want to have all the information, and everybody's been real patient. This is a great, fantastic group to work with, and I just want you to know I appreciate you very much. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Councilmember Pollock.
I had the opportunity to visit with the middle school at Woods this last week. They invited me to come talk about local government for some learning that they're working on collectively about, how do societies and communities address issues and solve problems. And it was really great to go speak to those students there, to hear the types of questions that they were asking about, what does council do? How are we handling certain issues in our community? Suicide was actually one that they asked me about specifically, as well as COVID concerns. It was definitely a peek into what's on the minds of at least that group of students here in our community. And so I really appreciated the opportunity to go do that, and am hopeful that through the establishment of the Youth Council and other vehicles, we can continue to foster an understanding of what local government is for our students and encourage their participation and correspondence with us.
Okay. And the only thing I wanted to bring up tonight was the question was asked about, or I was following up with the county commissioners in reference to switching of dates for meetings. We have found that, first of all, the overlap that we really have is not that many meetings, first of all. Secondly, the county runs into the same problem that we run into. At times we have certain items that would have to be addressed by a specific time, and by flip-flopping dates, that messes that up. And so I think it's a consensus on both sides that it pretty much stays the way it is. Not to mention the fact that we also have other committees and meetings that we're on that would just completely coincide. And I think you brought it up, was the Chamber of Commerce is a good one to mention, because if we flip-flop those, we wouldn't be able to have a representative on that, and that's not the only one. So right now, it's looking as it just doesn't make sense to switch them, first of all, and secondly, everything's televised now. So if somebody wanted to be somewhere live on a specific issue that's coming up, they could certainly be there for that one and still catch the other one online. So it's probably best that we just leave things the way they are, because I think the consensus also is that if we change it, we're going to find all the things that we're not thinking about right now, that it's going to mess up, and we're going to have to go back and fix it. So other than that, that's all I have. So unless you have something else, Mr. City Manager, we'll end the meeting. Okay, thank you.